The large oak doors of courtroom number 3 creaked open as Judge Eleanor Whitfield stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. The grand courtroom of the New York State Supreme Court was packed, every bench filled with people desperate to know the outcome of one of the most controversial cases in recent history. At the front sat lawyers in tailored suits, behind them journalists with notepads ready, and in the back, families clung together, their eyes reflecting a mix of fear and defiance. Judge Whitfield, known citywide as Lady Justice, had earned her reputation through decades of sharp decisions and an unyielding adherence to the rule of law. Her presence commanded silence, her tailored black robe a testament to her precision and pride. With her iron gray hair pinned back and her piercing blue eyes scanning the room, she appeared every bit the impartial arbiter she was reputed to be. "All rise," barked the bailiff. The audience stood, the shuffle of feet punctuating the stillness as Eleanor seated herself behind the towering bench. "The Supreme Court of the State of New York is now in session, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Whitfield presiding," the bailiff announced. "Be seated," Eleanor instructed, her voice calm but firm. The crowd obeyed, the room descending into tense quiet. At the plaintiff's table stood Robert Devereaux, a seasoned corporate attorney representing Ascendant Realty Group. Devereaux's dark suit was immaculate, his smile sharp and confident. The audience's unease seemed to amuse him as he arranged his notes with deliberate precision. At the defense table sat a handful of pro bono lawyers, their files in disarray, representing tenants fighting to keep their homes in the face of mass evictions. Robert stepped forward. "Your Honor, Ascendant Realty Group has followed every legal procedure in acquiring the properties in question. Proper notice was served, deadlines were given, and yet these tenants refuse to vacate. Their continued occupancy halts the progress of redevelopment that would revitalize the neighborhood." In the far corner of the courtroom, unnoticed by most, sat a boy of about 10. His clothes were worn, his sneakers scuffed, but his posture was rigid. His name was Jonah Whitfield, and his brown eyes darted between the judge and Devereaux as he clutched a tattered sketchbook to his chest. Jonah's small fingers traced the spine of the notebook nervously, but his expression was determined. "Your Honor," Devereaux continued, his voice dripping with polished charm, "the properties in question are a blight on the city. This redevelopment plan will provide housing, jobs, and economic growth for thousands." A woman in the audience couldn't hold back. "You'll destroy families for profits," she shouted, tears brimming in her eyes. Eleanor's gavel struck sharply against the bench. "Order in the court," she demanded, her tone slicing through the tension. "Another outburst and you will be removed." Jonah winced at the sound of the gavel, his hand trembling as his pencil grazed his sketch pad. He was drawing the courtroom scene, capturing the tense faces, the lawyers' postures, and the smug look on Devereaux's face. Jonah's eyes flickered toward Eleanor, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty filling the room. Devereaux smirked as he resumed. "Your Honor, the economic benefits far outweigh the emotional attachments these tenants may have to their outdated homes. The law is clear." "Present your evidence of proper notice," Eleanor interrupted, her voice clipped. Devereaux nodded and gestured to a stack of neatly organized documents. "As you wish." In the back of the courtroom, Jonah's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the truth he carried pressing on him like an unbearable burden. His eyes flicked to the judge. Eleanor Whitfield, the woman whose name matched his, though she did not yet know it. His hand gripped the edge of the bench as he stood abruptly, his voice piercing through the courtroom. "Stop lying." The room froze. Heads turned in unison, all eyes locking onto the small boy standing defiantly at the back. Reporters whispered to each other as cameras pivoted toward him. Eleanor's gavel banged again, but this time, her expression faltered. She stared at the boy with a mix of confusion and unease. "Young man," she said, her voice firm but tinged with curiosity. "Approach the bench." Jonah hesitated, his fingers clutching his sketchbook tighter. Slowly, he walked down the aisle, his sneakers scuffing the polished floor. The crowd murmured as he passed, his determined steps a stark contrast to his small frame. He stopped directly in front of the judge's bench, looking up at Eleanor with eyes full of defiance. "What is your name?" Eleanor demanded, leaning forward slightly. "Jonah Whitfield," the boy replied, his voice steady. The name hit her like a thunderclap. Eleanor's grip on her gavel slackened and it clattered onto the bench. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The reporters' pens flew across notepads, and the families in the gallery exchanged bewildered glances. Eleanor's usually stoic expression cracked, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. "Court is adjourned for the day," she announced abruptly. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bailiff, see that this boy remains here." The room erupted into chaos as the crowd filed out. Jonah stood alone at the front, his knuckles white as he clung to his sketchbook. For the first time, Eleanor saw him not as an interruption, but as a ghost from her past, a child with her daughter's unmistakable eyes. Eleanor sat in her chambers, the door firmly shut against the world outside. Her trembling hands clutched the letter Jonah had handed her, its edges worn and crumpled from being carried. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Sarah's, her daughter's neat cursive spelling out "Mom," in a way that made Eleanor's chest ache with regret. She hesitated, the weight of years of estrangement pressing on her. When Sarah had left over a decade ago, they'd had one final argument that Eleanor never allowed herself to revisit. Eleanor had been convinced that Sarah's choices were reckless, that her disapproval was justified. But now, holding this letter, those years of distance felt like a hollow justification for her silence. Slowly, Eleanor opened the envelope. "Dear Mom, if you're reading this, then Jonah has found you, and I'm gone. I never thought it would end like this, but I've learned that life doesn't wait for us to fix our mistakes. I should have called you. I should have come back home. But pride runs deep in this family, doesn't it? I guess I got it from you. This isn't about us, though. It's about Jonah and something bigger than the two of us. For the past 3 years, I've worked in accounting for Ascendant Realty. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Then I started noticing things. Big things. Money moving in strange ways, missing records, projects in poor neighborhoods where residents would mysteriously fall ill. When I tried to ask questions, I was warned to stop. But I couldn't. People are getting sick, Mom, kids like Jonah. And when I dug deeper, the answers became dangerous. I documented everything: emails, financial reports, photos of sites where they've been dumping chemicals. I tried to find someone who would listen, someone who could help, but Ascendant is everywhere. Then I got sick, and now I know why. Mom, I don't know how much time I have left. But if you're reading this, I need you to do what I couldn't. Protect Jonah. He's all I have, and he's seen things that no child should have to see. I've taught him to notice details, to use his talent for drawing to tell stories. He's stronger than I ever was. The evidence is in a safe place. Jonah knows where to find it. Trust him, even if it's hard. I know you've spent your whole life believing in justice, and now I need you to fight for it. For Jonah, for me, and for everyone Ascendant has hurt. I love you, Mom. Always have. Always will. Sarah Eleanor's vision blurred as tears welled up, slipping down her cheeks. The letter fell from her hands onto the polished surface of her desk. She sat back in her chair, her composure shattered, the weight of her failures crashing down on her. Her daughter had been crying out for help, and she hadn't listened. Sarah had died alone, scared and fighting a battle she couldn't win. And now, her grandson stood in the same storm, carrying secrets that could unravel everything Eleanor had worked for. She inhaled shakily, wiping her tears, and reached for her phone. "Stephanie," she said when her clerk answered, her voice hoarse. "Cancel my afternoon docket. I need to file emergency custody papers for a child." Jonah sat stiffly in a leather chair in Eleanor's chambers, his sketchbook clutched protectively to his chest. The room felt too big and too formal, with its tall bookshelves and gleaming desk. The only sound was the faint tick of a clock on the wall. Eleanor poured a glass of water with unsteady hands and set it in front of him. Jonah, she began, forcing calm into her voice. I need to ask you something very important. Where have you been staying? Jonah hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. Here and there, he muttered, sometimes with people from our building, other times, just wherever. The admission twisted Eleanor's heart. Why didn't anyone tell me? She asked softly. Jonah's gaze hardened. Mom wrote you letters. She called you. You didn't care. His words hit like a slap, and Eleanor's hand faltered. I didn't know how bad things were, she whispered. Jonah unzipped his backpack and pulled out a crumpled envelope. Mom made me promise to give this to you, he said, sliding it across the desk. She said it was really important. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the envelope. Her throat tightened as she opened it and began reading Sarah's letter, tears forming again as the words poured over her. When she finally looked up, Jonah was watching her with a mix of defiance and hope. She wanted you to help, he said, his voice cracking slightly. She thought you'd fight for her. Eleanor reached across the desk and placed her hand gently over his. I will, she said firmly. I promise you, Jonah. I won't let her down again. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat in her study, staring at the letter, and Jonah's sketches spread across her desk. Each drawing was a piece of the story Sarah had been trying to tell, a story of corporate greed, environmental destruction, and a mother's desperate attempt to protect her child. Eleanor picked up one drawing in particular. It showed trucks parked by a stream, their backs open as dark liquid poured into the water. The details were striking. The corporate logo on the trucks, the barren trees lining the stream, the serial numbers etched on the barrels. Jonah had captured it all with uncanny precision. A knock at the study door startled her. She turned to see Jonah standing there, his small frame silhouetted in the dim hallway light. Can't sleep? She asked. Jonah shook his head. Are you mad at me? Eleanor frowned. Why would I be mad? Because I yelled at you in court, Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked over to him, kneeling so they were eye level. You were brave, she said, her voice filled with warmth. You stood up for what was right. That's something your mom would be proud of. Jonah's lip quivered, and Eleanor pulled him into a hug. For a moment, the walls she'd built around herself crumbled entirely. As she held him, she made a silent vow. She would fight for Jonah, for Sarah, and for every family Ascendant had wronged, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as Eleanor brewed coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, but her thoughts were elsewhere. On the table sat a pile of documents she'd spent the night compiling, records of Ascendant Realty's environmental violations, court filings, and notes from Sarah's letter. Jonah's sketchbook lay open beside them, its pages a haunting reminder of what her grandson had witnessed. Jonah shuffled into the kitchen, his hair mussed from sleep. He clutched a blanket around his shoulders and stared at the stack of papers on the table. What are you going to do? He asked quietly, his voice still rough from the night before. Eleanor turned, her expression softening. I'm going to find the truth, she said, pulling out a chair for him, but I'll need your help. Jonah sat down, his small hands resting on the table. What can I do? She slid one of his sketches toward him, the one showing the trucks by the stream. You've already done so much. These drawings, they're evidence, but I need to know more. Do you remember where this was? Jonah nodded, his gaze fixed on the page. It was behind our old apartment building. Mom said the trucks came at night because they didn't want anyone to see. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Did your mom ever mention where she kept her evidence? The pictures, the notes she wrote down? Jonah hesitated, then looked up. There was a box, he said. She told me to stay away from it, but I saw her put it under the floorboards in our closet. Eleanor's mind raced. If Sarah had hidden the evidence, it might still be there, unless Ascendant had already found it. We'll go back today, she decided. Jonah's eyes widened. But what if they're watching? Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "I'll be with you," she said firmly. "We'll be careful, I promise." The drive to Jonah's old apartment was tense. Eleanor navigated the busy city streets with precision, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Jonah sat quietly in the passenger seat, his sketchbook resting on his lap. When they arrived, the building was eerily quiet. The once bustling complex now felt abandoned, its windows dark and its hallways empty. Eleanor parked a block away and walked with Jonah to the side entrance. "We're just here to look," she said softly as they climbed the stairs. "If anything seems off, we leave immediately." Jonah nodded, gripping her hand tightly. They reached the apartment, and Eleanor tried the door. It was locked, but the knob was loose, as if someone had forced it recently. Her heart sank as she pulled a small toolkit from her bag and worked quickly to pick the lock. Inside, the apartment was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor. Jonah froze in the doorway, his grip on Eleanor's hand tightening. "Someone's been here," he whispered. Eleanor scanned the room, her legal mind cataloging every detail. The closet door was ajar, the floorboards pried up and left haphazardly. "Stay close," she said, leading Jonah inside. She knelt by the closet, her fingers tracing the splintered wood. "They were looking for something," she murmured. "But maybe they didn't find everything." Jonah crouched beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the space. "Mom's box wasn't big," he said. "It could still be here." Eleanor pulled a flashlight from her bag and shone it into the narrow opening beneath the floorboards. Her breath caught when the beam illuminated a small metal container wedged against the wall. She reached in and carefully pulled it out, her fingers trembling. "This is it," Jonah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, prying open the lid. Inside were photographs, printed emails, and a worn notebook filled with Sarah's meticulous handwriting. Each page detailed dates, locations, and descriptions of Ascendant's illegal activities. "They didn't find it," Eleanor said, relief washing over her. "You were right, Jonah. Your mom kept it safe." Jonah's face lit up, but the moment was short-lived. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. "Someone's coming," Jonah hissed. Eleanor's mind raced. She quickly stuffed the box into her bag and motioned for Jonah to follow. They slipped out the back door just as the apartment door creaked open behind them. Back at Eleanor's house, the atmosphere was electric with urgency. The evidence Sarah had compiled was damning: emails detailing bribes to city officials, photos of toxic waste sites, and financial records showing Ascendant's profits from cutting corners. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, flipping through his mother's notebook. "She wrote down everything," he said, his voice filled with awe. Eleanor nodded, her heart aching with both pride and sorrow. "She knew what she was doing," she said. "Your mom was brave. She wanted to make sure the truth came out." The doorbell rang, jolting them both. Eleanor rose cautiously and peered through the window. Standing on the porch was Rebecca Taylor, a seasoned investigative journalist and an old acquaintance of Eleanor's. Eleanor opened the door. "Rebecca," she said, her tone wary. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca stepped inside, her expression serious. "You called me, remember? Said you had something big." Eleanor hesitated, then gestured for Rebecca to follow her into the kitchen. "This is Jonah," Eleanor said, placing a hand on her grandson's shoulder. "And this is what we have." She opened the metal box and spread its contents across the table. Rebecca's eyes widened as she scanned the evidence. "This is explosive," she said, her voice low. "If this gets out, Ascendant's entire operation could crumble." "That's the plan," Eleanor said, her tone steely. Rebecca looked up at her. "You realize the risk, don't you? Ascendant doesn't play fair. If they find out about this, they'll come after you, and him." She nodded toward Jonah. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "They've already taken enough from this family." I won't let them win. Jonah looked between the two women, his small voice cutting through the tension. Mom said the truth is the most important thing. She said we have to fight for it no matter what. Rebecca's gaze softened. Your mom was right, kid, she said. She turned back to Eleanor. If we're doing this, we need to move fast. I'll need to verify everything and get it to my editor. Once the story's out, Ascendant won't be able to silence us. Eleanor nodded. Do whatever it takes. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Rebecca worked tirelessly to piece together the story, while Eleanor prepared for the inevitable backlash. Jonah spent hours adding to his sketches, each drawing a powerful testament to what he and his mother had witnessed. When the story broke, it was like a bomb detonating across the city. Headlines screamed of corruption, environmental crimes, and a corporation's exploitation of vulnerable communities. The public outrage was immediate, and Ascendant found itself under siege from both the media and the courts. Eleanor knew the fight wasn't over. There would be lawsuits, threats, and attempts to discredit her. But as she stood in her kitchen, watching Jonah sketch with a peaceful expression on his face, she felt a glimmer of hope. Sarah's voice echoed in her mind. Protect Jonah. Fight for what's right. And for the first time in years, Eleanor knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Melissa picked up the newspaper from her front porch, her hands trembling slightly. The headline was a direct hit to her cause. Judge's personal vendetta. Questions arise in Keller Corporation case. Beneath the headline was a photo of Melissa leaving the courthouse, her hand protectively holding Jason's. The image, under any other circumstances, might have been seen as tender, a grandmother shielding her grandson. Now, it was weaponized as part of a narrative Keller Corporation was spinning to discredit her. Melissa closed the door behind her and unfolded the paper on the kitchen counter, scanning the article. Every word was calculated to portray her as a biased, vengeful judge abusing her position to settle personal scores. The reporter dredged up every minor controversy from her career, twisting facts and decisions to fit their narrative. Is everything okay? Jason's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a bowl of cereal in front of him. His eyes were tired. He hadn't been sleeping well. Melissa forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Everything's fine, she lied, tucking the paper under her arm. Jason wasn't convinced. He looked down at his cereal, stirring it idly with his spoon. I saw the men following us yesterday, he said quietly. In the black car. Melissa's stomach sank. She had noticed the car too, a dark sedan that had tailed them from the grocery store to the library. Her protective instincts flared. We'll be more careful, she assured him, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Rebecca. Turn on the news. Now. Melissa grabbed the remote and turned on the kitchen TV. The screen flickered to life, showing Andrew Keller standing at a podium outside the courthouse. His expression was grave, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. It pains me to bring this motion, Keller was saying, but Judge Whitman's clear conflict of interest makes it impossible for her to render an impartial judgment in this case. Jason's spoon clattered against his bowl. He's trying to stop you from being the judge? Before Melissa could respond, her phone rang. The chief judge's name flashed on the screen. Melissa, the voice on the other end began, heavy with tension. We need to talk about this motion, the media attention. It's becoming a circus. I understand, Melissa replied stiffly. I'll be there in an hour. After hanging up, she turned to Jason, her expression softening. I need to go to the courthouse, but I don't want you to be alone. I'm calling Rebecca to stay with you. Jason nodded, though his brow furrowed with worry. When Rebecca arrived, Melissa pulled her aside. Double-check the locks. Don't answer the door for anyone. If you see anything suspicious— I know, Rebecca interrupted, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll be fine. Go handle Keller. The courthouse was swarming with reporters when Melissa arrived. They crowded her car as she pulled into the reserved lot, shouting questions over one another. Judge Whitman, Is it true you're using your grandson to attack Keller Corporation? How long have you been planning this vendetta? Melissa ignored them, her face a practiced mask of neutrality, but inside she was seething. In her chambers, the chief judge was waiting, arms crossed and his expression grim. "This is a mess, Melissa," he said, wasting no time. "The motion cites your relationship with the boy, your daughter's former employment with Keller Corporation, and your recent investigation into their practices. All of which prove Keller's guilt, not my bias," Melissa argued. "That's not how the public sees it," the chief judge shot back. "The media is having a field day, and there are already calls for a formal inquiry into your conduct." Melissa felt the walls closing in, the weight of Keller's influence pressing against her. Everything she'd worked for, her reputation, her career, was on the verge of crumbling. But when she thought of Jason's brave face, his mother's letter, and the families Keller had hurt, she knew she couldn't back down. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Rebecca. "Someone's watching the house. Black sedan. Different from yesterday." Melissa's grip tightened on her desk. The chief judge was still talking about protocols and public perception, but all she could think about was Jason. "I need to go," she interrupted, already gathering her things. The reporters followed her to her car, their questions an incessant buzz, but she barely heard them. Her only thought was of Jason, alone at home with strangers watching from the street. Jason sat at the kitchen table with his sketchbook open, his pencil moving furiously across the page. Rebecca leaned over his shoulder, watching in quiet amazement as an image took shape. Workers in hazmat suits dumping barrels into a creek, every detail rendered with uncanny precision. "This is incredible, Jason," Rebecca said softly. "You've even drawn the serial numbers on the barrels." Jason paused, his hand hovering over the page. "Mom taught me to pay attention to details," he murmured. His voice caught slightly, and he added, "She said sometimes the smallest things tell the biggest stories." Rebecca carefully picked up another sketch. It depicted a late-night meeting between Andrew Keller and local officials, their faces eerily recognizable even in pencil. "Your mother would be proud of how you're using your gift," Rebecca said. Before Jason could reply, the sound of a car door slamming outside made them both jump. Rebecca moved toward the window, but the tension eased when she saw Melissa hurrying up the walkway. Melissa burst through the door, her face taut with worry. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. Jason nodded, pushing his sketchbook toward her. "I've been helping Rebecca with her story." Melissa sat beside him, flipping through the pages. Each drawing was more damning than the last. Secret meetings, illegal dumping, workers without proper protective equipment. The emotion in each stroke was palpable, Jason's anger and pain woven into the lines. "These are powerful, Jason," Melissa said quietly. "They could make a real difference in court." She hesitated, then added, "But testifying won't be easy. People will try to discredit you to make you doubt yourself." Jason's jaw tightened, his young face set with determination. "I'm not afraid of them." Melissa's voice cracked slightly. "Maybe you should be," she admitted. "I am." Jason looked up at her, his expression softening. "Mom always said running from bullies only makes them stronger. She'd want us to fight." Melissa pulled him into a tight hug, her tears falling freely as she whispered, "Then we'll fight. Together." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Melissa sat with Jason, reviewing the logistics of what testifying would mean. She explained the court procedures with deliberate care, ensuring he understood not just what he would face, but also why his testimony mattered. Jason listened intently, his small hands clutching a pencil as he sketched absent-mindedly in the margins of his notebook. "You're going to be questioned by their lawyers," Melissa said, her tone firm but reassuring. "They'll try to confuse you, make you doubt what you remember." Jason stopped drawing and looked up at her. "But I'm telling the truth. Why would they want to confuse me?" Melissa's heart ached at the innocence in his question. "Because the truth is dangerous to people like Keller," she said. And when people are desperate, they'll do anything to protect themselves. Jason's pencil moved again, his strokes sharper this time. He was drawing the courtroom as he imagined it. Keller sitting smugly at a table, Melissa standing tall in front of the bench and himself on the witness stand, smaller but no less resolute. "Do you think they'll believe me?" Jason asked softly, his eyes fixed on his sketch. Melissa reached over, gently placing her hand over his. "I believe you, and I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." The morning paper hit Melissa's doorstep with another devastating headline. "Keller's Crusade. Judge Whitman under fire for conflict of interest." Melissa's stomach churned as she read the article. It accused her of using Jason's tragic story to wage a personal war against Keller Corporation, twisting facts and manipulating public sentiment. Anonymous sources questioned her impartiality and hinted at misconduct, all designed to further erode her credibility. She folded the paper sharply, tossing it into the trash. But the damage was already done. Rebecca called shortly after. "Melissa, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight. "Someone broke into my office last night. They didn't steal anything, but they went through all my files." Melissa gripped the phone tighter. "Did they take any of Jason's sketches?" "No, I moved them to a secure location after the first threats," Rebecca assured her. "But this is escalating. Whoever's behind this wants to scare us into backing down." "They're watching us," Melissa said, glancing toward the drawn curtains of her living room. "Jason said he saw a car following us yesterday, and I got another text this morning. They know we're closing in." Rebecca's voice softened. "We're doing the right thing, Melissa. They wouldn't be pushing back this hard if we weren't." Melissa glanced over at Jason, who was quietly drawing at the kitchen table. He didn't look up, but she knew he was listening. "I won't let them scare us," Melissa said firmly. Later that day, Melissa met with Daniel Perez, a former environmental lawyer who had been battling Keller Corporation long before Jason was born. His small office was cluttered with old case files, faded newspaper clippings, and books stacked precariously on every surface. "I can't help you," Daniel said bluntly, pushing the folder of evidence Melissa had handed him back across the desk. "Keller destroyed my career once. I won't give them another chance." Melissa glanced at Jason, who had tagged along despite her reservations. He sat quietly in the corner, sketching as always. "Show him," Melissa said softly. Jason stood and approached Daniel's desk, holding out his sketchbook. Daniel hesitated before flipping through the pages. His expression shifted as he studied the detailed drawings of illegal dumping sites, barrels marked with hazmat symbols, and workers in suits unloading chemicals by moonlight. But it was the sketch of Jason's mother that made Daniel pause. Sarah, in her Keller Corporation uniform, standing near a chain-link fence with warning signs in the background. "Your mother worked for them?" Daniel asked, his voice softening. Jason nodded. "She tried to tell people what they were doing," he said quietly. "Then she got sick." Daniel's hands trembled as he turned to another page. "These locations," he said, pointing to one of the drawings. "I recognize this. It was part of my case against Keller 5 years ago. We had evidence, pictures, witness statements. But it all disappeared before we could prove anything." Rebecca, who had joined them, leaned forward. "We've been looking into that site," she said. "There's a record of a chemical spill 3 months before Sarah died. Keller called it minor, but the cleanup crews were there for weeks." Daniel stood abruptly and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. "I kept everything," he said, spreading papers and photos across his desk. "Every document, every lead. I knew someday someone would need it." Melissa and Rebecca studied the evidence, connecting the dots between Keller's past and present crimes. "These new dumping sites Jason has drawn?" Daniel said, tapping a sketch. "They're not following their usual cleanup protocols. They're getting careless." Melissa leaned forward, her voice steady. "How do we use this?" Daniel's eyes lit up with renewed determination. "We show a pattern. Negligence, bribery, corruption. Keller has been doing this for years, and now we have evidence tying it all together. Jason pulled out another drawing from his sketchbook, this one of a warehouse his mother had worked at before she died. "Mom used to take pictures with her phone," he said. "She told me she hid them at work." Daniel examined the sketch closely. If those photos are still there, they could blow this case wide open. Melissa's resolve hardened as the pieces fell into place, but the threats continued. A manila envelope appeared on her doorstep that evening. Inside was a photograph of Jason walking home from school, clearly taken without his knowledge. A note was clipped to the photo. "Children should be protected. Back off." Melissa's blood ran cold. She rushed through the house, locking every door and window, her heart pounding. Jason sat at the kitchen table, oblivious to the note but sensing her unease. "What's wrong?" he asked, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. Melissa hesitated, then sat beside him. "Someone sent us a warning," she admitted. "They want us to stop." Jason's face darkened. "Are you going to?" Melissa looked into his determined eyes and shook her head. "We're not letting them win." Jason nodded and opened his sketchbook to a blank page. He began to draw Melissa standing tall in her judge's robes, herself and Jason staring down a shadowy figure meant to represent Andrew Keller. "Is that how you see us?" Melissa asked softly, her voice catching. Jason nodded. "That's who we are." Melissa pulled him close, her fear melting into resolve. The threats were real, and the danger undeniable, but Jason's courage reminded her why she couldn't stop. "We'll fight," she whispered. "Together." The sun had barely risen when Melissa, Jason, Rebecca, and Daniel gathered in Melissa's living room. The air was thick with urgency as they laid out a map of the city, marking potential locations where Keller Corporation might be hiding crucial evidence. Or worse, where Jason's mother's hidden photos might still be stored. Jason leaned over the table, his fingers tracing the lines of a particular sketch he had drawn weeks ago. It depicted the warehouse where his mother had worked, with distinctive markings on the walls and specific locations of surveillance cameras. "This is the one," he said quietly, tapping the page. Melissa studied the sketch, comparing it to the map. "Miller Street Warehouse," she murmured. "The same one mentioned in Daniel's old files." Rebecca glanced at her phone. "We're going to need a plan to get in. Keller's security is going to be tight, especially now that they know we're closing in." Daniel nodded. "I've still got a contact who worked there. He might be able to get us past the first level of security, but after that, we're on our own." Melissa's jaw tightened. "Then we do whatever it takes. If Sarah's evidence is there, it could change everything." Jason looked up from his drawing. "I want to come with you." "No," Melissa said immediately, her voice firm. "It's too dangerous." "But I remember things Mom told me," Jason argued. "I can help you find where she hid the photos." Melissa crouched beside him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "You've done so much already, Jason. You've been braver than anyone should ever have to be. But this, I need you safe. Please." Jason's eyes brimmed with frustration, but he nodded reluctantly. That evening, as the city settled into darkness, Melissa and her team approached the Miller Street warehouse. The building loomed in the shadows, its exterior imposing with high fences and security cameras that swept the perimeter. Rebecca parked the car a few blocks away, and they walked the rest of the way, their breaths visible in the crisp night air. Daniel checked his phone. "My contact says we have a 10-minute window. Keller's security team rotates shifts, and this is the only gap." Melissa adjusted her scarf, her heart pounding. "Let's go." They slipped through a side entrance, bypassing the first level of security with a code Daniel's contact had provided. Inside, the warehouse was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of industrial freezers and the distant echo of dripping water. Jason's sketch had been precise. Following its details, they navigated past rows of storage containers until they reached a secluded office space at the back of the building. "This is it," Melissa whispered, her flashlight illuminating the desk and filing cabinets. Daniel started rifling through the drawers while Rebecca checked the walls for hidden compartments. Melissa's attention was drawn to a loose floorboard near the corner of the room. exactly as Jason had sketched it. She crouched down and pried it open, her breath catching as she pulled out a small metal box. "Got it," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and adrenaline. Rebecca shone her flashlight on the box as Melissa opened it. Inside were dozens of photographs, USB drives, and handwritten notes. The photos were damning, images of workers dumping barrels of chemicals into streams, memos from Keller executives detailing cost-cutting measures that compromised safety, and logs of payments to local officials to keep it all quiet. "This is everything," Rebecca said, her voice hushed. "Sarah documented everything." Melissa's throat tightened as she held one of the photos, a shot of Sarah standing near a contaminated creek, her face determined despite the danger. "We need to move," Daniel urged, glancing at his watch. "Our window's almost closed." They quickly gathered the evidence and retraced their steps, but as they reached the main exit, the sound of voices stopped them in their tracks. "Someone's here," a guard's voice echoed. Melissa's heart raced. She motioned for the others to stay low as the guard's footsteps grew closer. Rebecca pulled out her phone and began typing frantically. "I'm sending the photos to my editor," she whispered. "If we get caught, at least the evidence will be out there." Melissa nodded, her grip tightening on the metal box. The guards passed by without noticing them, and the group slipped out the side door, running into the night. Back at Melissa's house, Jason was waiting anxiously. His face lit up with relief when he saw them walk through the door. "Did you find it?" he asked, rushing to Melissa's side. Melissa knelt in front of him, holding out the box. "Your mom kept everything," she said, her voice breaking. "She was so brave, Jason, just like you." Jason opened the box, his eyes scanning the photos and notes. His small fingers brushed over a picture of Sarah smiling in front of their old apartment building. "She wanted to stop them so bad," he whispered. "And now we will," Melissa said, pulling him into a hug. The next day, the courthouse was packed. The media had caught wind of the new evidence, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Melissa sat beside Jason in the gallery, their attorney presenting the case to Judge Thompson. The box of evidence was displayed prominently on the table, its contents cataloged and ready to be entered into the record. Rebecca testified first, detailing her investigation and the threats she had faced. Her words were clear and measured, but the weight of the story she told was undeniable. Then it was Melissa's turn. She stood tall, her voice steady as she recounted Sarah's efforts to expose Keller's crimes, and the lengths the corporation had gone to silence her. Finally, Jason was called to the stand. He walked up slowly, clutching his sketchbook like a shield. "You're a brave boy, Jason," the prosecutor said kindly. "Can you tell us about these drawings?" Jason nodded, opening his sketchbook to the first page. "These are places my mom showed me," he began, his voice small but firm. "She said it was important to remember everything." As he flipped through the pages, the courtroom fell silent. Each drawing was a piece of the puzzle, dumping sites, secret meetings, and the faces of those responsible. When he reached the final page, a drawing of his mother standing tall against the backdrop of Keller's facility, his voice wavered. "She said if we don't fight bullies, they win. She didn't want them to hurt anyone else." Melissa wiped her eyes, pride swelling in her chest. The prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we believe this evidence not only proves Keller Corporation's negligence, but also their intentional cover-up of their crimes." Judge Thompson studied the evidence for a long moment before speaking. "This court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with criminal charges against Keller Corporation. Additionally, I am ordering an immediate investigation into all sites identified in this case." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Andrew Keller's face was pale, his lawyers scrambling to confer. Melissa reached over and took Jason's hand. "You did it," she whispered. Jason looked up at her, his eyes filled with both relief and sadness. "We did it." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles and media coverage. Keller Corporation's stock plummeted, and lawsuits poured in from families affected by their actions. Melissa stepped down from the bench, choosing instead to advocate for those who had been silenced for so long. At home, Jason continued to draw, his sketches now filled with images of hope and healing. One evening, he handed Melissa a new drawing, a portrait of their family with Sarah's smiling face in the background. "She'd be proud of us," he said softly. Melissa hugged him tightly. "She would be proud of you." As they sat together, surrounded by the remnants of their fight, Melissa felt a peace she hadn't known in years. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth could prevail. The courthouse buzzed with tension the morning the trial against Keller Corporation formally began. Protesters crowded outside, carrying signs with Jason's sketches printed on them, now symbols of resistance. Reporters jostled for position near the doors, shouting questions at anyone who entered. Melissa and Jason arrived early, slipping through a side entrance with Daniel and Rebecca. Jason clutched his sketchbook tightly, his small frame stiff with nerves. "You don't have to do this," Melissa said softly, crouching to meet his eyes. Jason shook his head. "Mom wanted people to know the truth. I'm ready." Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've got your back, kid. You're not alone in this." Inside the courtroom, Keller's legal team filled the defense table. Andrew Keller sat at the center, his polished demeanor betraying no hint of the chaos unraveling around him. But Melissa could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter, stood to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than one corporation's negligence. It's about greed, corruption, and a blatant disregard for human lives. Keller Corporation put profits over people, and today, we will prove it." She walked to the evidence table, where Jason's sketches and Sarah's documents were displayed. "You will hear from witnesses who risked everything to expose the truth. You will see evidence gathered at great personal cost, and by the end of this trial, there will be no doubt about Keller's guilt." The defense attorney rose next, his tone calm and measured. "While we sympathize with the tragic loss of Sarah Whitman, the evidence presented will show that Keller Corporation operated within the bounds of the law. Any claims to the contrary are based on misinterpretations, coincidences, and unverified accounts." Melissa clenched her fists under the table. The carefully crafted lies were a stark reminder of the uphill battle they faced. Jason's turn to testify came on the second day. He walked to the witness stand, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. The room fell silent as he took the oath, his small voice steady as he promised to tell the truth. Evelyn approached him with a kind smile. "Jason, can you tell the court about these drawings?" Jason opened his sketchbook, turning to the first page. "These are the places my mom showed me," he said, his voice clear but quiet. "She said they were important. She said I should remember everything, just in case." Evelyn held up one of the sketches, a detailed drawing of barrels being dumped into a creek. "How do you know these barrels were there?" "I saw them," Jason replied. "Mom and I walked there sometimes. She said the water smelled wrong." "And what happened to your mom after that?" Evelyn asked gently. Jason's gaze dropped to his lap. "She got sick," he said. "Really sick, and then—" His voice cracked, but he straightened, looking directly at the jury. "And then she died." Melissa's heart ached as she watched him, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. She wanted nothing more than to rush to his side, but she knew he needed to do this on his own. The defense attorney, a man with graying hair and a calculated smile, rose for cross-examination. He paced in front of the witness stand, his tone almost condescending. "Jason, you're a very talented artist," he began. "These drawings are quite detailed, but isn't it possible that you imagined some of these things? That your mind filled in gaps?" Jason frowned. I remember everything. Mom told me to pay attention to details." The lawyer held up another sketch, this one of a late-night meeting between Keller executives. "You drew this from memory, correct?" "Yes," Jason said firmly. "But you were a child at the time. Memories can be unreliable, can't they? Jason hesitated, his brow furrowing. Melissa tensed, but before she could intervene, Jason spoke again. Mom said people would try to make me doubt what I saw, he said, his voice growing stronger. But I know what I saw, and I drew it so I wouldn't forget. The defense attorney opened his mouth to continue, but the jury's expressions told him the damage was already done. Jason's unwavering conviction had struck a chord. Outside the courthouse that evening, the crowd erupted into applause as Jason and Melissa stepped into the fresh air. Protesters held up signs reading, "Justice for Sarah" and "Keller must pay," their voices a chorus of support. Jason looked up at Melissa. "Did I do okay?" Melissa knelt beside him, her eyes filled with pride. "You were incredible, Jason. Your mom would be so proud of you." Over the next few days, the prosecution presented Sarah's evidence. The photos, memos, and financial records painted a damning picture of Keller Corporation's operations. But it was Rebecca's testimony that delivered the final blow. Standing tall at the witness stand, Rebecca described the threats she had faced while investigating Keller, the break-ins at her office, and the lengths the corporation had gone to cover up their crimes. "These aren't just isolated incidents," she concluded. "This is a pattern of corruption, and it has cost lives." The defense tried to discredit her, pointing to her history of exposing corporate misconduct as evidence of bias. But Rebecca held her ground, her voice unwavering. The final day of the trial arrived with a storm brewing outside. Rain lashed against the courthouse windows as Evelyn delivered her closing argument. "Keller Corporation thought they could bury the truth," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "But thanks to the bravery of Sarah Whitman, her son Jason, and everyone who came forward, that truth is now undeniable." She gestured to the evidence table, where Jason's sketches and Sarah's documents sat. "This is not just about one family's loss, it's about holding those in power accountable. It's about justice." The defense's closing argument was polished but hollow, a final attempt to sow doubt where none remained. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom mounting with each passing minute. Finally, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. "Guilty." A wave of relief swept through the room. Melissa reached for Jason's hand, squeezing it tightly as tears streamed down her face. Andrew Keller's expression was a mix of disbelief and rage as he was escorted out in handcuffs. For the first time, the man who had caused so much pain looked small and powerless. In the weeks that followed, Keller Corporation faced a cascade of lawsuits and criminal charges. The verdict sparked a broader investigation into corporate misconduct, leading to reforms in environmental regulations and whistleblower protections. Melissa left her position as a judge, choosing instead to work as an advocate for families affected by corporate greed. Jason, now free from the shadow of fear, poured his energy into his art, using it to tell stories of resilience and hope. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jason handed Melissa a new drawing. It showed their family, Melissa, Jason, and Sarah, standing together under a bright sky. "She's still watching over us," Jason said softly. Melissa pulled him close, her heart full. "And she always will be." Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, proving that even in the face of unimaginable loss, the truth could prevail. The trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a new chapter for Melissa and Jason, but the aftermath of their battle against Keller Corporation continued to ripple through their lives. Public interest in the case remained high, and the story became a rallying cry for activists, journalists, and communities across the country. Melissa sat at the kitchen table one rainy evening, flipping through a thick stack of letters. They had been pouring in since the verdict, messages from families who had been displaced by Keller, from whistleblowers who had found the courage to come forward, and from strangers moved by the bravery of a young boy and his grandmother. Jason sat nearby, working on a new drawing. His sketchbook, once filled with scenes of corruption and loss, now featured images of resilience and hope, families rebuilding their homes, children playing in parks, and his mother's smiling face. "Look at this one," he said, sliding a sketch toward Melissa. It was a picture of their house, with Melissa and Jason standing on the front porch. In the background, Sarah's image appeared, her hand resting protectively on Jason's shoulder. Melissa's breath caught. "Jason, this is beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jason smiled shyly. "I wanted to show her watching over us, like you said." Melissa reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "She'd love it, and she'd be so proud of you." Despite the victory in court, the fight wasn't over. Keller Corporation's top executives were still under investigation, and new allegations of wrongdoing emerged almost daily. Melissa spent her days working with community groups, helping displaced families navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives. Rebecca's exposés continued to dominate the headlines, shining a light on corporate corruption and inspiring other journalists to dig deeper. She had become a hero to many, though the threats against her persisted. One evening, she arrived at Melissa's house with a folder of documents. "I've been working on something," Rebecca said, setting the folder on the table. "It's bigger than Keller. There are other companies doing the same thing, dumping chemicals, bribing officials, ruining communities." Melissa's brows knitted. "How can we take on something that big?" Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "The same way we took on Keller, one step at a time, and with the truth on our side." Jason, listening from the couch, looked up. "If you need more drawings, I can help." Rebecca smiled. "We might just take you up on that." The house felt livelier now, filled with the sounds of laughter and the scratch of Jason's pencil as he worked on his latest project. Melissa had turned her spare bedroom into a makeshift art studio, complete with a drafting table and shelves stocked with supplies. Jason thrived in the new space, his creativity blossoming. He began submitting his work to local art contests, and even received an offer to illustrate a children's book about environmental conservation. One afternoon, Melissa found him sitting in the studio, a letter in his hand. "What's that?" she asked, sitting beside him. Jason handed her the letter. "It's from the museum," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Melissa scanned the page, her eyes widening. It was an invitation for Jason to showcase his sketches in a special exhibit about activism and art. "They want to feature your work," she said, beaming. Jason's face lit up. "Do you think Mom would have liked that?" Melissa pulled him into a hug. "She would have loved it, and so do I." The exhibit opening was a resounding success. People from all walks of life came to see Jason's sketches, now framed and displayed under bright gallery lights. Each piece told a story, from the haunting images of Keller's dumping sites to the hopeful depictions of recovery and justice. As Melissa walked through the exhibit, she overheard visitors discussing the impact of the trial and the courage it took for a young boy to stand up to a corporation. She felt a swell of pride, not just for Jason but for Sarah, whose bravery had set everything in motion. Near the end of the night, Jason took the stage to say a few words. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the crowd. "These drawings started as a way to remember my mom and what she taught me. She always said that even small things can make a big difference. I hope my work shows that no matter how small you feel, you can stand up for what's right." The audience erupted into applause, and Melissa wiped away tears as she watched Jason bow modestly before stepping off the stage. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Melissa and Jason found moments of peace amid the whirlwind of public attention. They spent weekends hiking in the nearby woods, a favorite pastime of Sarah's, and evenings sharing stories about her over cups of hot cocoa. One day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jason turned to Melissa. "Do you think Keller will ever come back?" he asked, his tone serious. Melissa shook her head. "They're finished, Jason. And even if someone like them tries to hurt people again, there will always be someone to stand up and fight back, just like we did." Jason nodded, seeming reassured. "And you'll never have to face something like that alone," Melissa added. "Not as long as I'm here." Jason leaned against her, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. Months later, Melissa received a letter from a family she had helped during the trial. They had been displaced by Keller's redevelopment project, but were now moving into a new home, thanks to the settlement funds from the case. "Your courage gave us hope," the letter read. "Thank you for fighting for families like ours." Melissa folded the letter carefully, tucking it into a box she had started keeping, one filled with mementos from their journey. It held Sarah's letter, Jason's sketches, and now notes of gratitude from the people whose lives they had touched. As the seasons changed, Melissa and Jason began planting a garden in their backyard, something Sarah had always dreamed of doing but never had the chance. They worked side by side, their hands covered in dirt as they planted flowers, vegetables, and a small tree in Sarah's memory. "This is for her," Jason said, patting the soil around the tree's base. Melissa smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "She'd be so proud of us." The tree grew quickly, its branches stretching toward the sky. And as it did, so did the bond between Melissa and Jason, a testament to the strength they had found in each other and the legacy of the woman they both loved. Years later, Jason's art would go on to inspire a new generation of activists, his sketches appearing in textbooks, museums, and advocacy campaigns around the world. But no matter how far his work reached, he always carried with him the lessons his mother had taught him and the unwavering support of his grandmother. Melissa, now retired, spent her days volunteering at local schools, sharing her story with children who dreamed of making a difference. And every evening, she and Jason would sit on the porch, watching the sunset and remembering the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, love, truth, and resilience could light the way forward. The courthouse's marble halls were silent as Melissa and Jason entered, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. It had been weeks since Keller's conviction, but the aftermath of the trial continued to ripple through their lives. This morning, Melissa was scheduled to meet with the prosecutor's office to discuss the ongoing investigations into Keller Corporation's senior executives. Jason, ever curious, had insisted on tagging along. "Do you think they'll all go to jail?" Jason asked, his sketchbook tucked under his arm as always. Melissa glanced down at him, her lips curling into a faint smile. "I hope so, sweetheart. But justice can take time. What matters is that we've started the process." Jason nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, and turned his attention to the courtroom doors they passed. His fingers itched to draw, already envisioning the tall ceilings and the sunlight streaming through the high windows. When they arrived at the prosecutor's office, Evelyn Carter greeted them warmly. "Jason, you're becoming quite the celebrity," she teased. Jason blushed, mumbling a polite hello before burying his nose in his sketchbook. Evelyn motioned for Melissa to sit. "We've uncovered new evidence," she began, lowering her voice. "Bank records, offshore accounts, and even more damning communications between Keller's top brass. It's going to strengthen our case against the other executives." Melissa leaned forward, her interest piqued. "And what about reparations for the families?" "That's still being negotiated," Evelyn admitted. "But Keller's assets are frozen, and we're confident the courts will prioritize restitution." Jason, listening quietly, raised his hand like he was in a classroom. "Can we use some of the money to build a park?" Melissa and Evelyn exchanged surprised glances. "A park?" Melissa asked. Jason nodded earnestly. "For all the families who lost their homes? Mom always said parks were places for people to heal." Evelyn smiled. "That's a beautiful idea, Jason. Let's make sure it's on the table when we meet with the families." Back home that evening, Melissa found Jason sitting on the porch, his sketchbook balanced on his knees. He was working on a new drawing, the beginnings of a park taking shape on the page. There were trees, a playground, and a pond with ducks swimming peacefully. "Is that the park you mentioned?" Melissa asked, settling into the chair beside him. Jason nodded, his pencil moving steadily. "I think it should have benches for people to sit and talk. And maybe a garden with flowers, like the one we planted for Mom." Melissa felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached over, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "She would have loved this idea, Jason, and I'm sure the other families will too." Jason looked up at her, his eyes bright with hope. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Melissa's voice was thick with emotion. "She'd be proud beyond words, just like I am." The next community meeting was packed. Dozens of families gathered in the community center, many of them still adjusting to life after Keller Corporation's downfall. Some had begun rebuilding their homes, while others were staying with relatives or in temporary housing. Melissa stood at the front of the room, Jason by her side. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We've made incredible progress, but there's still work to do. Today, we want to hear your ideas for how we can rebuild, not just houses, but a sense of community." Jason stepped forward, holding up his sketchbook. "I drew this," he said, showing the group his park design. "It's a place where we can all come together, a place to remember what we've been through and to start something new." The room fell silent as people studied the drawing. Then, one by one, they began to nod. "That's a wonderful idea," Sarah Martinez said, her voice full of warmth. "My kids would love a park like that." "It's perfect," James Thompson added. "Something beautiful to come out of all this pain." Melissa felt a surge of pride as she watched Jason's idea take root in the hearts of the people around them. Over the next few weeks, plans for the park began to take shape. Melissa worked tirelessly with city officials, using her connections to secure permits and funding. Jason threw himself into his sketches, refining every detail of the design. Rebecca Collins covered the project in a series of articles, calling it a testament to resilience and hope. Her words brought national attention to the effort, and donations began pouring in from across the country. The families who had once been victims of Keller Corporation came together to help. Some volunteered their time, while others contributed ideas or materials. The sense of unity that had formed during the trial now blossomed into something tangible. Jason spent most of his free time at the construction site, sketching as workers laid the foundation and planted trees. Melissa often joined him, her heart swelling as she watched the park come to life. The grand opening of Whitman Park was a celebration like no other. A large crowd gathered, their faces glowing with anticipation. Children ran ahead, eager to explore the playground, while adults marveled at the beauty of the garden and the winding paths. A small stage had been set up near the entrance where Melissa and Jason stood side by side. "Thank you all for being here," Melissa began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This park is more than just a place. It's a symbol of what we've accomplished together, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, we can find light." She turned to Jason, handing him the microphone. Jason hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "This park is for my mom," he said simply. "And for everyone who's ever been hurt by people like Keller, I hope it helps you feel happy again." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. As Jason cut the ribbon, children flooded into the playground, their laughter filling the air. Melissa watched them with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. "You did it," Rebecca said, stepping up beside her. Melissa shook her head, smiling. "We all did." As the weeks turned into months, Whitman Park became a cherished part of the community. Families gathered there for picnics, children played in the sun, and flowers bloomed in the garden dedicated to Sarah Whitman's memory. Jason's art continued to thrive, with his drawings of the park featured in galleries and publications. He began teaching art classes at the community center, inspiring other children to use their creativity to make a difference. Melissa found a renewed sense of purpose, working closely with advocacy groups to push for stricter environmental regulations. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing her story and encouraging them to fight for justice. Through it all, she and Jason remained each other's greatest support, their bond unshakable. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Melissa and Jason sat together on a bench in the park. "Do you think she'd like it?" Jason asked, gazing at the garden filled with his mother's favorite flowers. Melissa smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "She'd love it, Jason, and she'd be so proud of you." Jason rested his head against her, the weight of the past finally giving way to the peace of the present. In the distance, children's laughter mingled with the rustling leaves, a testament to the strength of a community that had risen from the ashes, and to the love of a family that had found its way back to each other. The days following Whitman Park's grand opening were filled with an overwhelming sense of hope. Families who had once been displaced now gathered there regularly, sharing stories and laughter beneath the shade of the newly planted trees. For Jason and Melissa, the park became a sanctuary, a physical reminder of their victory and the strength they had found together. But the fight for justice was far from over. Melissa stood in her home office one morning, a letter from the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in her hand. It detailed new findings tied to Keller Corporation, sites in other states where illegal dumping had poisoned entire communities. Her heart sank as she realized the scale of what they had uncovered. "It's like they've left a trail of destruction everywhere they've been," she murmured to Rebecca, who had stopped by for coffee. Rebecca set down her cup, her expression grim. "We always suspected Keller wasn't the only one. This might be our chance to expose the rest." Jason, listening from the doorway, stepped inside. "Can I help?" he asked, his sketchbook already in hand. Melissa looked at him, her heart swelling with pride. "We'll need all the help we can get." Their first step was gathering testimonies from other affected communities. Melissa and Rebecca traveled across the country, visiting small towns where Keller's operations had left scars both physical and emotional. Jason insisted on coming along, using his art to document what they saw. In one town, they met a mother who had lost her son to cancer after years of drinking contaminated water. In another, an elderly farmer described how his land had been ruined by toxic runoff. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last, but it only strengthened their resolve. Jason's sketches became a powerful tool, capturing the pain and resilience of the people they met. Rebecca included them in her articles, which soon sparked a nationwide movement. Activists rallied behind their cause, demanding accountability from not just Keller, but other corporations with similar practices. Back at home, Melissa worked late into the night, poring over legal documents and preparing for the next round of court battles. Jason often stayed up with her, sketching quietly at the kitchen table. One evening, he slid a new drawing across the table. It depicted Melissa standing in a courtroom, her head held high as she faced a group of corporate executives. "Is this what you think I look like in court?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. Jason nodded. "You're like a superhero, but for real life." Melissa laughed softly, ruffling his hair. "I don't know about that, but I'll take it." The second trial against Keller Corporation began 6 months later. This time, the stakes were even higher. The evidence Melissa and her team had uncovered pointed to decades of environmental crimes spanning multiple states. The courtroom was packed, with reporters lining the back rows and protesters gathered outside. Melissa, no longer a judge but an advocate, sat at the prosecution's table, her presence a symbol of the fight for justice. Jason watched from the gallery, his sketchbook resting on his lap. He had drawn the courtroom earlier that morning, capturing the tension and determination in every line. The defense tried their usual tactics, questioning the credibility of the witnesses and the authenticity of the evidence. But Melissa and her team were ready. Evelyn Carter, the lead prosecutor, presented a damning case complete with documents, photographs, and testimonies from dozens of affected families. Jason's sketches were entered as supplemental evidence, providing a visual narrative that resonated deeply with the jury. When it was Melissa's turn to testify, she spoke with a clarity and conviction that left the courtroom silent. "These corporations think they're untouchable," she said, her voice steady. "They believe their money can shield them from accountability, but today we're here to prove them wrong." Her words were met with quiet murmurs of agreement from the gallery, where the families they had fought for sat shoulder to shoulder. Jason was called to the stand once again, his presence a reminder of the human cost of corporate greed. "Jason," Evelyn began gently, "can you tell us why you've continued to draw these scenes?" Jason thought for a moment before answering, Because it helps people see what happened. Sometimes it's hard to understand just by hearing it. But when you see it, it's real. He held up his latest sketch, a haunting image of a poisoned river surrounded by dying trees. The jury leaned forward, studying the details. "And why do you think it's important to show these things?" Evelyn asked. Jason met her gaze, his voice unwavering. "Because if we don't, people will keep getting hurt, and no one deserves that." Melissa wiped away a tear as she watched him, her heart swelling with pride. The trial lasted weeks, each day bringing new revelations about the extent of Keller's crimes. The defense scrambled to counter the growing mountain of evidence, but their efforts fell flat against the raw power of the testimonies and Jason's evocative art. When the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in applause. Families embraced, tears streaming down their faces as the weight of years of suffering began to lift. Melissa hugged Jason tightly, whispering, "We did it." "No," Jason replied with a small smile. "You did it." The victory marked a turning point not just for Melissa and Jason, but for communities across the country. The fallout from the trial led to sweeping changes in environmental regulations and renewed scrutiny of corporate practices. Whitman Park became a hub for activism, hosting events and workshops aimed at empowering others to stand up for justice. Jason's art continued to play a central role, inspiring countless people to fight for what they believed in. Melissa, now a sought-after speaker, traveled the country sharing her story. But no matter where she went, she always returned to the park, where Jason waited with new sketches and stories of his own. One sunny afternoon, as they sat beneath the tree they had planted for Sarah, Jason handed Melissa a small book. "What's this?" she asked, flipping through the pages. "It's a book of my drawings," Jason explained. "I wanted to put them all together so people can see the whole story." Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she studied the pages, each one a testament to their journey. "It's perfect," she said, pulling him into a hug. "Just like you." Jason beamed, his face alight with pride. As the years went by, Jason's book became a bestseller, spreading their message far and wide. Melissa watched with awe as her grandson grew into a young man, his passion for justice and art never wavering. On the anniversary of their first victory in court, they returned to the park for a special ceremony. A new plaque had been installed, bearing an inscription that read, "In memory of Sarah Whitman and all those who fought for justice, may this park remind us of the power of truth, resilience, and love." Jason traced the words with his fingers, a small smile playing on his lips. "She'd like this," he said softly. Melissa nodded, her heart full. "She'd love it." As they stood together, surrounded by the community they had helped rebuild, Melissa felt an overwhelming sense of peace. They had turned their pain into purpose, their loss into legacy. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The months following the second trial brought Melissa and Jason deeper into the national spotlight. News outlets hailed their fight against Keller Corporation as a landmark victory, not just for environmental justice, but for families affected by corporate greed. Yet, with the acclaim came new challenges. Melissa received a flurry of invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and legal forums. She accepted many of them, eager to use her platform to inspire change. Jason often accompanied her, his sketches displayed at each event as powerful visual testaments to their journey. One evening, after a particularly emotional panel discussion, Jason sat quietly in their hotel room, his sketchbook open on his lap. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Melissa asked, sitting beside him. Jason hesitated, then turned the sketchbook toward her. On the page was a drawing of a large tree, its roots sprawling deep into the ground and its branches reaching high into the sky. Scattered around it were smaller trees, their roots intertwined with the larger one. "It's us," Jason explained, "and everyone we've helped. We're all connected now, like a big forest." Melissa felt tears prick her eyes. "That's beautiful, Jason, and so true. What we've done, it's bigger than just us." Jason nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I think we should help even more people, not just with court stuff, but with other things too. Melissa smiled, wrapping an arm around him. Then that's exactly what we'll do. Back in their hometown, Melissa began organizing new initiatives to support the families displaced by Keller Corporation. She partnered with local nonprofits to provide job training, counseling, and educational programs. Jason, ever eager to contribute, started an art workshop at the community center. The first session was chaotic but joyful. Children of all ages crowded around Jason, eager to learn how to draw. He patiently guided them through basic techniques, encouraging them to tell their own stories through art. Art is like a superpower, he told the group, his voice steady despite his nerves. It can show people what words can't. Melissa watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. Jason had grown so much, his quiet strength and resilience inspiring everyone around him. As the years passed, Whitman Park evolved into more than just a symbol of hope. It became a gathering place for activists, educators, and artists, all working toward a common goal of justice and healing. One afternoon, Melissa stood at the edge of the garden they had planted for Sarah, watching as Jason painted a mural on one of the park's walls. The mural depicted their journey, courtroom battles, united families, and the park itself, all rendered in Jason's distinct style. It's incredible, Rebecca said, joining Melissa. He's incredible, Melissa replied, her voice tinged with emotion. Rebecca nodded, her gaze fixed on the mural. You know, this place wouldn't exist without you two. You've given so many people a second chance. Melissa smiled. We just did what we could. The real strength came from the community. Jason's art continued to garner attention, leading to exhibitions across the country. At one gallery opening, Melissa marveled at the crowds gathered to see his work. People of all ages wandered through the space, their expressions ranging from awe to deep contemplation. One piece, a haunting sketch of a poisoned river, drew a small group of children. Jason knelt beside them, answering their questions with patience and care. Why is the water so dark? One girl asked, pointing to the sketch. It's what happens when people don't take care of the earth, Jason explained gently. But we can fix it if we work together. Melissa watched the interaction, her pride mingling with gratitude. Jason's ability to connect with people, to inspire them, was a gift she knew would continue to grow. The next major step in their journey came when Melissa was invited to testify before Congress. The government was considering new legislation aimed at holding corporations accountable for environmental damage, and Melissa's voice was seen as pivotal. The hearing room was packed as Melissa took her seat at the witness table. Jason sat in the audience, flanked by Rebecca and Daniel. His sketchbook rested on his lap, ready to capture the historic moment. Ms. Whitman, a senator began, your efforts have been nothing short of remarkable. Can you tell us why this legislation is so important? Melissa leaned forward, her voice steady. Because lives are at stake. Communities like mine have suffered for far too long at the hands of corporations that prioritize profit over people. This legislation isn't just about punishment, it's about prevention. It's about ensuring no one else has to endure what we've endured. She spoke passionately about Sarah, Jason, and the countless families affected by Keller Corporation. Her words resonated deeply, and by the time the hearing concluded, it was clear she had made an impact. As they left the hearing room, Jason handed Melissa a new sketch. It depicted her at the witness table, her expression fierce and determined. I wanted to remember this, he said simply. Melissa hugged him tightly. You're my greatest supporter, Jason. I couldn't do this without you. When the legislation passed months later, Melissa and Jason were invited to the White House for the signing ceremony. It was a surreal experience, standing in the Rose Garden as the president praised their work. This victory belongs to everyone who fought for justice, Melissa said during her speech, and to the families who turned their pain into purpose. Jason beamed as he presented the president with one of his sketches, a depiction of the park that had become a beacon of hope. As life settled into a quieter rhythm, Melissa and Jason found joy in the simple moments, sharing meals, tending to their garden, and exploring new hiking trails. Their bond had grown unbreakable, forged through adversity, and strengthened by love. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Jason handed Melissa a bound book. "What's this?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "It's all my drawings," Jason said. "From the very beginning, I wanted to put them together so people could see the whole story." Melissa flipped through the pages, her eyes misting as she saw their journey laid out in Jason's art. "This is incredible," she said, pulling him into a hug. "Your story will inspire so many people, Jason, just like you inspire me." Jason grinned, his face lighting up with pride. In the years that followed, Jason's book became a bestseller, sparking conversations about justice, resilience, and the power of community. Melissa continued her advocacy work, traveling the country to support families and push for stronger protections. Whitman Park thrived, its paths filled with children's laughter and the vibrant colors of Jason's murals. The garden dedicated to Sarah remained a place of quiet reflection, a reminder of the love and courage that had brought them there. Together, Melissa and Jason built a legacy, one rooted in hope, resilience, and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest times, the light of truth could shine through. The world seemed brighter after the signing of the new environmental legislation. Melissa and Jason had achieved what once felt impossible, justice for their family and countless others affected by corporate greed. Yet, even with this monumental victory, they knew their journey was far from over. One morning, Melissa sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open to an email from a university asking her to lecture on ethics in the legal system. Invitations like this had become common, and she accepted most of them. Still, she felt a tug of uncertainty. "Do you think I'm the right person to teach about ethics?" she asked Jason, who was seated nearby, sketching. Jason looked up, his brow furrowed. "Of course you are. You've shown everyone what it means to do the right thing." Melissa smiled, reaching over to tousle his hair. "You always know just what to say." Jason grinned, holding up his latest drawing. It was a portrait of Melissa standing at a podium, her expression determined as she addressed a crowd. "Is this how you see me?" she asked, studying the confident figure in the sketch. Jason nodded. "That's how everyone sees you, like a hero." Melissa felt a lump rise in her throat. She wasn't sure she deserved that title, but if Jason believed in her, she knew she couldn't let him down. The lecture hall buzzed with energy as students filed in, their notebooks and laptops ready. Melissa stood at the front of the room, her nerves simmering beneath a calm exterior. Jason sat in the front row, his sketchbook open and his pencil poised. "Thank you all for being here," Melissa began, her voice steady. "Today, we're going to talk about the intersection of law and morality and why doing what's legal isn't always the same as doing what's right." She shared her story with the students, weaving in lessons about courage, accountability, and the importance of listening to the voices of the marginalized. Jason's sketches captured the moment perfectly, Melissa's passionate gestures, the attentive faces of the students, and the light streaming through the tall windows of the lecture hall. Afterward, a line of students formed to speak with her, their questions ranging from technical legal queries to personal reflections on her journey. "Your story inspired me to pursue law," one young woman said, her voice tinged with emotion. "I want to fight for people like you did." Melissa felt a swell of pride as she shook the student's hand. If her experiences could inspire even one person to make a difference, it was worth every hardship. Back at home, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Jason spent his days at school and his evenings at the community center, where his art classes had grown so popular that a waiting list had formed. Melissa, meanwhile, focused on expanding their advocacy efforts. She partnered with environmental organizations to launch educational campaigns and worked with lawmakers to strengthen protections for vulnerable communities. One afternoon, as they walked through Whitman Park, Jason paused near the garden dedicated to Sarah. "Do you think she knows what we've done?" he asked, his voice quiet. Melissa knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. I know she does, Jason, and I know she's proud of us, of you. Jason smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. The next chapter of their journey began unexpectedly, with a phone call from a documentary filmmaker. We want to tell your story, the filmmaker explained, not just about Keller, but about how you've turned tragedy into change. Melissa hesitated. She had grown used to public attention, but the idea of laying her life bare on such a scale felt daunting. Jason, however, was excited. Can we show them the park, and the art classes, and the garden? Melissa couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. All right, she said, but only if we get to show the community's story too. This isn't just about us, it's about everyone who's fought alongside us. The filming process was both exhausting and exhilarating. The crew followed Melissa and Jason through their daily routines, capturing everything from Jason's art workshops to Melissa's meetings with lawmakers. They interviewed families who had been displaced by Keller Corporation, activists who had joined the fight for justice, and even the workers who had rebuilt Whitman Park. One particularly emotional moment came when Jason led the crew to the tree he and Melissa had planted for Sarah. This is for my mom, he said, his voice steady despite the tears welling in his eyes. She's the reason we started all of this. The crew filmed as Jason sketched the tree, his pencil strokes deliberate and precise. Melissa stood nearby, her heart aching with both love and pride. When the documentary premiered, it was met with widespread acclaim. Critics praised its raw honesty and emotional depth, while audiences were moved by the resilience and determination of the people it showcased. Melissa and Jason attended the premiere, sitting nervously in the packed theater. As the credits rolled, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Afterward, dozens of people approached them, sharing how the documentary had inspired them to take action in their own communities. You've changed lives, one woman said, tears streaming down her face. Melissa glanced at Jason, who was busy signing copies of his art book for a group of children. It's all thanks to him, she said softly. The documentary sparked a wave of interest in Jason's art, leading to opportunities he had never imagined. He was invited to collaborate with environmental organizations, illustrating campaigns that aimed to raise awareness about pollution and climate change. One of his pieces, a vivid depiction of a polluted river transforming into a thriving ecosystem, became the centerpiece of a global conservation initiative. Melissa watched as Jason's confidence grew with each new project. He had found his voice through his art, and he was using it to make a difference. Years later, Melissa and Jason returned to the courthouse where their journey had begun. The building felt smaller now, less intimidating, but the memories it held were as powerful as ever. Jason, now a young man, carried a portfolio of his artwork under one arm. He had been invited to speak at a conference on youth activism, and Melissa couldn't have been prouder. As they walked through the familiar halls, Jason paused outside the courtroom where they had faced Keller Corporation. This is where everything changed, he said, his voice filled with awe. Melissa nodded, her hand resting on his shoulder. And look how far we've come. Jason smiled, his gaze steady. Thanks to you? Melissa pulled him into a hug, her heart full. No, Jason. Thanks to us. In the years that followed, Jason's art and Melissa's advocacy continued to touch lives around the world. Whitman Park remained a symbol of hope, its paths filled with laughter and its walls adorned with murals that told the story of their fight for justice. And through it all, Melissa and Jason stood side by side, their bond unshakable, their love for Sarah and their community guiding them forward. Together, they proved that even in the face of unimaginable loss, the human spirit could rise, creating something beautiful out of the ashes.